It was just another average morning at Naval Station Norfolk, America's largest naval base, the soft mist hanging in the air as the sun started to rise. But that morning, something extraordinary was about to unfold, something no one could have predicted. A woman, dressed in plain clothes, walked into the heart of the military base with nothing but a faded civilian badge clipped to her chest. No military uniform. No title. Just a simple ID. The crew on the dock scoffed at her, one of them even muttering under his breath, "Another bureaucrat, probably here for an audit." As the sailors carried on with their duties, one of them laughed when she asked about the USS Triton's schedule, the most advanced nuclear submarine in the fleet. "Lady," he sneered, "those boats don't surface for pencil pushers like you." The crowd around her chuckled in agreement, thinking they had the upper hand, dismissing her as just another government worker with no business being there. The base's heavy machinery hummed in the background as she quietly stood there, waiting, unbothered by the mockery. But then, as if the sea itself had been waiting for her signal, a series of sonar pings lit up the screens. The water began to swell, rippling unnaturally. In the blink of an eye, without any warning, the USS Triton, a massive Ohio-class nuclear submarine, began to surface right in front of her. No tugboats, no personnel guiding it. Just the submarine, emerging like it had been summoned. The crew froze. Every sailor, every officer, every person on that dock stood speechless. What they didn't know was that this woman wasn't just a civilian. That simple badge wasn't a piece of bureaucratic insignia, it was a symbol of something far more powerful. And now, the world would have to reckon with it. As the submarine rose from the depths, slowly, silently, the reality of the situation hit them all at once. Who was this woman? What did she command? And why was the USS Triton responding to her and her alone? Stay with me because in the next few moments, we're about to unravel a secret that could change everything you thought you knew about power, authority, and the unseen forces that keep the world turning. Ready to dive deeper? Let's go. Camille Wilson wasn't the type of person you'd expect to see at a naval base like Norfolk. At 36, she stood tall at 5 feet 7 inches, with a lean, athletic build that hinted at her years of dedication to staying in shape. Her short, natural curls framed a face that was both striking and approachable. Camille had a presence about her that made people notice, but not in the way most would expect for someone with so much authority. Dressed in a simple, weathered navy blazer and khaki pants, she hardly looked the part of someone who held the kind of power that could make the world pause. No uniform, no rank, just the faint outline of her civilian badge clipped to her chest. Her badge wasn't a decoration or a symbol of mundane office work. It was a gateway to a world most people never even knew existed. Deep well. Few had heard of it, even fewer understood its significance. But those who did, knew to tread carefully around it. Camille worked for the Department of Energy's Special Oversight Division, a branch so secretive and classified that even high-ranking military officers barely understood its role. Deepwell was established under the radar, far from the public eye, created to oversee the very systems that most people assumed were beyond oversight, the nuclear deterrent, the lifeblood of America's military might. Camille's job was to ensure that the chain of command in the military remained unbroken, even when dark forces tried to manipulate it. She was the watchdog no one could see coming, always ready to step in when things went sideways. She had seen the unthinkable in her career, the darkest corners of government operations, the hidden battles being fought in silence. But it wasn't until today that she truly felt the weight of her role. Her calm demeanor belied the seriousness of her mission. No matter how many times she walked into situations like this, she knew the stakes would always be high. The fate of the nation's most sensitive assets rested on her shoulders. Though Camille had always worked behind the scenes, keeping the wheels of bureaucracy and military strategy turning, today was different. Today, her quiet resolve was about to face the most critical test yet. She didn't just walk into Norfolk expecting to observe a routine inspection. She was here to confront something far more insidious. A threat had emerged, one that jeopardized the integrity of America's nuclear command, and Camille was the one chosen to find it. She wasn't the kind of person who relied on authority alone. In fact, she rarely spoke much about her position. Her actions were her words. But when the stakes were this high, silence was often the loudest form of communication. Her mind was sharp, her instincts honed after years of navigating the most complex and covert military operations. Camille wasn't here to make friends or prove a point. She was here to do a job, and she knew exactly what needed to be done. As she walked toward Pier 12, her eyes scanning the area, every detail seemed amplified. She knew that the military, the men and women who served here, would view her with skepticism, maybe even disdain. But that didn't matter. She was more than just a civilian. She was the guardian of a system that had kept this country safe for decades. And today, she was here to make sure it stayed that way. As Camille made her way to the security checkpoint at Pier 12, the subtle hum of naval operations continued around her. Sailors and officers moved with practiced precision, their movements sharp, their minds focused. But when they noticed her, dressed in simple civilian clothes, no military insignia to mark her as anything other than just another government worker, they didn't hesitate to dismiss her. "Another one of those bureaucrats," one sailor muttered under his breath, his voice thick with the kind of disdain that only comes from years of dealing with the occasional government inspector or audit officer. Camille kept walking, unbothered by the sneers and whispers that followed her every step. She had been underestimated before, and she knew it was a useful tool. At the security checkpoint, Chief Petty Officer Lucas tried to hide his amusement when she asked for the submarine's schedule. His raised eyebrow told her all she needed to know. He wasn't used to civilians asking about military operations, and certainly not one in such an informal get-up. "I'm afraid that's classified," he said flatly, handing her a look that said he couldn't be bothered to entertain such questions. "You'll have to speak to someone higher up if you want that info." Camille didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly reached for her badge, holding it up just enough for him to see. "Department of Energy, Special Oversight Division. I need the schedule for the USS Triton," she said, her tone unyielding yet measured. Lucas took a glance at the badge and scoffed. "Another audit, huh?" he said, clearly unimpressed. His words were sharp, laced with a hint of mockery. He handed the badge back to her without even bothering to check her clearance. The sailors around them couldn't help but chuckle. One of the younger petty officers leaned against a bollard, making no attempt to hide his amusement. "Lady, those boats don't surface for pencil pushers," he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Laughter rippled through the small crowd, the kind that stung with the bitterness of superiority. Camille stood there, unmoving, her face a mask of indifference. To them, she was just another civilian asking questions she had no right to. But what they didn't know was that Camille wasn't here to follow the usual rules. She was here to ensure that those very rules didn't get bent or broken. Without a word, she nodded at Lucas, then turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement. She made her way to the edge of the pier, where she stood alone, facing the vast expanse of the water. The military personnel returned to their duties, the laughter fading as they went back to their tasks. But Camille knew something they didn't. This wasn't about an audit or a schedule. She wasn't here to ask permission. She was here to ensure that the very systems that kept their operations secure remained intact. And if she had to let them underestimate her for a while longer, that was fine by her. She was used to it. Minutes passed. The water remained still, and Camille stood with the kind of quiet confidence only someone who knew their place in the world could possess. She wasn't going anywhere. Not until she got what she needed. As Camille stood by the edge of the pier, the quiet of the morning stretched out before her. The vast waters of the harbor looked almost too peaceful, too still, considering the heavy machinery and military activity just beyond the dock. Sailors went about their work, the sounds of ropes tightening and metal clanging against concrete filling the air. But Camille didn't flinch. She kept her gaze fixed on the water, unwavering. The first few minutes passed without incident. No one seemed to think much of the woman standing there, alone, her figure barely noticeable against the towering ships in the distance. But then something shifted. A soft hum in the air. A faint vibration under her feet. It was almost imperceptible at first, the kind of disturbance that would easily be dismissed by anyone who wasn't paying attention. But Camille was. She felt it in her bones before anyone else did. The sea, which had been so still, now seemed to shift, the water rising, rippling in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Her instincts kicked in, but she didn't move. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what was happening. The sonar system at the naval base had already picked up on it, the signals flashing across the screens in the operations room. A massive object was approaching, something large, something powerful. The sailors on the dock looked around, confused, murmuring amongst themselves. The water continued to swell, its ripples growing larger, more pronounced. Then, in a flash of motion that seemed to happen in an instant, the unmistakable dark silhouette of an Ohio-class nuclear submarine, the USS Triton, began to emerge from the depths. It was slow at first, the water parting as the hull of the massive submarine broke through the surface with an eerie silence. The sheer size of the vessel was overwhelming as it rose higher, breaking the surface with ease. Its sleek black body glistened in the morning light, the water cascading off its curves as it slowly made its way into full view. The sailors froze, their jaws dropping as they took in the scene unfolding before them. The submarine wasn't supposed to be here. It wasn't on the schedule, and it certainly wasn't expected to surface in the middle of the dock like this. But it was. And it was for her. The USS Triton held position directly in front of Camille, steady and unyielding. No one moved. No one spoke. The presence of the submarine was a clear, undeniable message. Camille wasn't just another bureaucrat. She was someone far more significant. The hatch on the conning tower opened, and a figure emerged. Captain Ryan Barrett, the commanding officer of the USS Triton, stepped out, his gaze immediately locking with Camille's. Without hesitation, he snapped to attention and saluted her. The air around them seemed to grow still. Camille's calm composure contrasted sharply with the utter chaos and disbelief unfolding around her. She had called it. The rest of them were just catching up. The USS Triton held its position just off the edge of the pier, its massive frame towering above the water like a silent giant. The water, which had once been calm, now swelled around the submarine's hull, creating a swirling vortex of waves that seemed to reverberate across the entire dock. The sound of the water splashing against the steel, and the creaking of the submarine as it settled into place filled the otherwise still air. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as though time itself had frozen. The sailors on the dock remained where they stood, some wide-eyed, others with their hands still on equipment, unsure of what to do or even how to react. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the weight of realization. Captain Ryan Barrett stood at attention, his face unreadable, but his eyes never leaving Camille's. His salute, sharp and professional, carried more meaning than any formal gesture. It wasn't just a sign of respect. It was a recognition of authority. Camille Wilson, the woman who had stood so quietly just moments before, was now the person in charge. She wasn't just any government official. She was someone with the power to command the very assets that most people could only dream of controlling. Captain Barrett, secure your vessel. Camille's voice was steady, her tone calm but commanding. Prepare for inspection. We have work to do. Without hesitation, Captain Barrett gave a nod, acknowledging her order without a word. His eyes flickered for just a moment, a brief flash of admiration or perhaps surprise, but he quickly masked it, turning toward his crew. Secure the vessel, he barked, and immediately, the crew sprang into action, moving with precision as they prepared for the inspection. The submarine, which had once seemed so intimidating and out of reach, was now under her command. The sailors, still standing frozen in disbelief, now seemed to snap back to attention. As Captain Barrett directed his men, the crew began to move as if the air around them had shifted, their demeanor changing from uncertainty to respect. Some exchanged glances, but the mockery from earlier was gone. Camille's presence was like a silent force, commanding without needing to shout, without even needing to say much at all. The weight of her authority didn't come from the badge she wore or the clearance she held. It came from the calm confidence in her eyes, the way she carried herself, and the undeniable fact that the USS Triton, America's nuclear deterrent, had just surfaced for her, and her alone. As she watched the crew work, Camille allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. She had proven her point, not with words, but with actions. The military had learned what it needed to know. She wasn't a civilian. She wasn't someone to be dismissed. She was the one who ensured the system stayed in check. And now, they all knew it. Inside the secure operations room, the air was thick with tension. The high-tech monitors lining the walls cast a cold blue light over the faces of the senior officers, their eyes fixed on the screen that displayed the status of the USS Triton and other assets. Camille stood at the front of the room, her posture straight and unwavering, as she prepared to address the gathered military brass. Behind her, the low hum of the air conditioning seemed to emphasize the stillness, as if even the building itself was holding its breath. Commander David Harrison, a seasoned naval officer with over 25 years of service, was the first to speak, his voice steady but tinged with unease. "I don't understand," he began, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the screen. "The Triton isn't scheduled for any operations today. This doesn't make sense. What's really going on here, Wilson?" Camille's gaze remained unbroken, focused, and calm. "You're not the only one confused, Commander. But this is why I'm here. The Triton surfaced at the exact moment I arrived. It wasn't a coincidence." Her voice carried the weight of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about, and though she didn't raise her voice, her words cut through the tension like a sharp knife. General Robert Kane, the Joint Chiefs representative, shifted in his chair. "Are you suggesting someone deliberately manipulated the schedule?" His tone was skeptical, almost dismissive, but Camille could see the doubt in his eyes, the tiny crack in his otherwise controlled demeanor. "I'm not suggesting anything, General. I'm telling you. We've been monitoring for anomalies in military communications for months, and this is no accident. Someone inside your command structure is trying to subvert the chain of command." Camille's words rang with certainty, and the room went deathly quiet. It wasn't the kind of thing you just brushed off. The implications were staggering. Colonel Margaret Stone, another senior officer, leaned forward, a hand pressed against her temple, deep in thought. "What are you proposing we do? We can't just start an investigation based on what? A gut feeling." Her voice carried frustration, but also an undercurrent of fear. The idea that their own operations might have been compromised shook her to her core. Camille's eyes flickered toward the screen again, the data now streaming in faster. "This is no gut feeling, Colonel. We've tracked movements that don't align with the standard protocol. We've identified modified communication pathways. Someone has been trying to insert unauthorized commands into the system. And whoever it is, they have access to the highest levels of military intelligence." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The weight of Camille's words hung in the air, impossible to ignore. 4 years, they had operated under the assumption that their systems were secure, that their chain of command was infallible. But now, that certainty was being shattered, piece by piece. "I'm calling for a full sweep of all communications," Camille continued, her voice steady. "We need to isolate the compromised pathways, and we need to do it now. If we don't, we risk catastrophic failure." The tension in the room grew thick, palpable. Commander Harrison finally broke the silence, his voice low and resigned. "We'll follow your lead, Wilson. But I want to know exactly who's behind this, and I want them found before we face another breach." Camille nodded, her face as cold as the room around them. "You'll have your answers. But we don't have time to waste." The meeting continued, the officers now fully aware that their world had shifted. They were no longer in control of the situation. Camille Wilson was. The briefing room was no longer a place of calm deliberation. Now, it buzzed with urgency as senior military officers filed out, their faces etched with concern. The meeting had been a turning point. Camille had laid out the facts. An operation was underfoot, one that threatened to undermine the entire military chain of command. It wasn't just a breach of protocol. It was an insidious infiltration of the system itself. Camille remained in the center of the room, her sharp eyes scanning the data streams projected onto the wall. The numbers didn't lie. Something had been tampered with, and she needed answers fast. The initial shock had worn off, but the reality of what they were facing was settling in, heavier than ever. "We need to move quickly," Camille said, her voice steady but firm. She didn't look up as she spoke, but the room's tension only seemed to increase. Every officer in the room understood the gravity of her words. The entire infrastructure they had relied on for decades was at risk. Lieutenant Commander Aaron Pierce, a young officer known for his tech expertise, was the first to speak up. "We've identified a few points where the signals were rerouted, but the origins are still unclear. We're working with limited data right now. Whoever did this covered their tracks well." Camille turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Keep digging, Pierce. We need more than just traces. I want names. Who's behind this?" As Pierce nodded and began typing on his tablet, Major Sarah Hughes, a senior intelligence officer, stepped forward. "Camille, there's another issue. Our satellite imagery has flagged unusual movements near Alaska. Russian naval forces are operating in the region, but the timing doesn't line up with any scheduled exercises. We need to consider the possibility of external involvement." Camille's jaw tightened as she absorbed the new information. "That's not a coincidence," she muttered under her breath. The realization was dawning on her that this wasn't just an isolated event. It was part of something much larger, an operation that might have international implications. Major Hughes continued. "The altered communication systems match known Russian interference tactics, but we're not sure who the players are yet. We need to know if they've infiltrated higher levels of the chain of command, particularly with regards to our nuclear assets." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the weight of Hughes' words. For a moment, Camille allowed herself a breath, but there was no time to relax. "Prepare the team," she said, her voice sharp. "We're going to have to act fast, or we'll be one step behind the people trying to destroy everything we've built." The investigation was no longer a matter of standard procedure. It had turned into a race against time. As the team dispersed, Camille's mind raced, each step they took now critical. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to compromise the military. They were playing a much bigger game, one that could change the course of history. And Camille wasn't going to let them win. As the investigation continued, Camille found herself reflecting on something deeper than the immediate threat at hand. It was clear to her that this wasn't just about a few compromised officers or a couple of rogue elements trying to bypass security protocols. No, this was a test of the very system that had kept the United States secure for decades. And in the middle of it all, the lesson became glaringly obvious. Oversight was the foundation of any great system. Without it, even the most carefully constructed institution could crumble under the weight of its own failures. The military, for all its power and precision, relied on a chain of command that could be manipulated. The very system designed to safeguard the nation was vulnerable to internal threats, and Camille knew this better than most. She had spent years working in the shadows, ensuring that someone, no matter how high up, was always watching, always aware, and always ready to step in when necessary. The fact that someone had tried to bypass that oversight only reinforced the importance of the work she and her colleagues did. In her mind, oversight wasn't just about reviewing procedures or checking off boxes. It was about ensuring that those in power, whether military or civilian, never forgot the weight of their responsibilities. It was about holding people accountable, even when no one was watching, and making sure that no single individual or faction could ever have the unchecked power to make decisions that could destroy everything they stood for. It was about maintaining balance, keeping the system intact, and making sure the right decisions were made, even when the stakes were higher than ever before. In the days that followed, Camille spent hours in meetings with senior officials, explaining what she had discovered, and what needed to be done next. There was no room for error. She understood the pressure that came with this responsibility, and it was something she never took lightly. The weight of the nation's security was a burden, but it was a burden she had willingly taken on. The alternative, turning a blind eye, ignoring the cracks in the system, was something she couldn't afford. As the investigation gathered steam, Camille couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. Not because the system was failing, but because she and her team were preventing it from failing. They were the safety net, the invisible guardians who ensured that no matter what happened, the nation's greatest assets, their military, their security, their future, remained in safe hands. It wasn't glamorous work, and it didn't earn her the spotlight. But it was work that mattered. Camille's role was never about recognition or accolades. It was about doing what needed to be done, and doing it right. She understood that oversight was not just a job, but a commitment. A commitment to ensuring that power was never left unchecked. And in moments like these, when the integrity of the entire system was at risk, her resolve was stronger than ever. Because, in the end, it was always about accountability. And it was always about keeping the country safe, no matter the cost. The gravity of the situation began to set in as the investigation uncovered more troubling details. With every new lead Camille followed, the stakes grew higher. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't just an isolated incident of corruption or malfunction. It was an attempt to dismantle the very structure that had kept America's military secure for decades. The operation was larger, more coordinated, and more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. One evening, as the team pored over encrypted communications and satellite images, the air in the command center grew thick with tension. The faces of the officers around Camille were drawn, their once confident postures now stiff with uncertainty. Reports from around the country began to pour in, each one painting a darker picture. The compromised communications weren't just happening in one location, they were everywhere. Strategic missile silos, Navy bases, even key Air Force command posts were affected. The threat wasn't just from within, it was an insidious, coordinated attack from all angles, designed to paralyze America's defense systems when it mattered most. Camille's mind raced as she sifted through the information. There were just too many moving parts, too many variables, and the more she saw, the more she understood just how close they were to disaster. The situation was dire, but one thing became painfully clear: they didn't have the luxury of time. If they didn't act fast, the nation's defense capabilities could be compromised in ways that no one would be able to fix. In the midst of the growing chaos, Camille received a call from Commander Harrison. His voice was tight with urgency. "We've identified the last piece," he said, his words clipped. "It's Kitsap Naval Base. The USS Maine's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Lawrence, has taken control of the vessel and is refusing to follow orders from any military channel. He's demanding immunity in exchange for the evidence he holds about the entire operation." Camille's heart skipped a beat. The USS Maine was one of the most critical assets in the Pacific, and now it was in the hands of someone who was actively trying to undermine the system. The implications were immense. If Lawrence had the evidence he claimed to possess, it could reveal an even deeper conspiracy, possibly involving elected officials in Washington. But the more immediate concern was the security of the submarine. If Lawrence wasn't contained, the situation could escalate rapidly. "Get a team ready. I'm heading to Kitsap," Camille ordered without hesitation. As the team scrambled to prepare, Camille stood still for a moment, the weight of her responsibility pressing down on her. This wasn't just about stopping a rogue officer. This was about safeguarding the integrity of the nation's most critical systems. The decision she was about to make could have far-reaching consequences, but there was no room for second-guessing. Camille's phone buzzed again. It was Director Harlow, her voice more urgent than ever. "Camille, you need to be careful. This goes deeper than we thought. We don't know who's really behind Lawrence, but we can't let this spin out of control." "I know," Camille replied, her voice calm but resolute. "That's why I'm going in." The decision had been made. Camille had no choice but to act, and the clock was ticking. The nation's security rested on her ability to navigate this dangerous web of deceit, and there was no turning back. The tension that had gripped the team began to dissipate as the situation at Kitsap Naval Base came to a head. Camille stood outside the secure room, her arms folded across her chest, watching the officers move with urgency. Her team had successfully neutralized the immediate threat, isolating Lieutenant Commander Lawrence and securing the USS Maine. The conspiracy was unraveling piece by piece, but the fight wasn't over yet. As the hours ticked by, the last pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Satellite images showed that Lawrence had been right about the senators involved, and new intelligence confirmed that the corruption had extended further than they had imagined. But despite the complexity of it all, Camille felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She knew that the system was far from perfect, but at least it was still intact. For now, the chain of command had been restored, and the threat had been contained. The military would continue to operate, and the nation's security was no longer at risk. In the distance, the sound of helicopters filled the air, their blades slicing through the sky as they prepared for the final stages of the operation. Camille watched them for a moment, her thoughts drifting. She had done what was necessary, as always, and in the end, that was all that mattered. As the operation wrapped up and the base began to return to normal, Camille allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The weight of responsibility she carried never truly left her, but there was a sense of relief in knowing that she had made the right decisions. No one would ever know the full extent of what had happened. That was the price of her work, keeping the country safe while remaining invisible. But as she turned and walked toward her car, she couldn't help but smile, knowing that she had done what was needed. The system had survived. And so had she. As Camille drove away from Kitsap Naval Base, the weight of the past few days settled into her bones, but there was a sense of peace she hadn't expected. The operation had been intense, and the danger had been real, but in the end, it was a reminder of why she did what she did. It wasn't for recognition. It wasn't for praise. It was because there were some things in this world that required an invisible hand, guiding the course without anyone even knowing it was there. The life lesson wasn't just about power or authority. It was about responsibility. The kind of responsibility that required stepping into the shadows when the light was too bright and staying silent when the world was eager to shout. Camille had learned early on that true leadership didn't come with a title. It came with the willingness to take on the hardest tasks, to make decisions when others couldn't, and to carry the burden of the nation's security quietly, without complaint. As she navigated the streets, Camille thought about how most people went through life never knowing the full extent of the threats that surrounded them. They lived in peace, largely unaware of the forces working tirelessly behind the scenes to protect them. That was the price of safety, the silent vigilance that went unnoticed. And yet, it was the most important work anyone could do. In the end, Camille knew this. Some burdens were meant to be carried in silence. They didn't need to be seen, just as the work of the unseen protectors didn't need to be acknowledged. What mattered was that the world was safer because of it. And that was enough.